Is 3 minutes until we start. Thank you for joining the opening plenary. My name is Sihle Ngesi-Magubane and I am your host for today. Just going to spend a few minutes allowing people to come in before we officially begin. Just a reminder for everyone as you join that you please keep your video off and your audio on mute. You will get an opportunity to speak and share with each other once we go into breakaway rooms later on during the plenary. But for now, kindly make sure that you do keep your audio off and your video off. See, we have Kathy here. We have Alistair, welcome. Deb, Delana, Fatima, Herman, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Lamulu Dladla is also here. Of our candidate fellows, welcome. Welcome, Virosha. Welcome, Liam. Welcome, Tato. Welcome, Madeline. Please do make use of the chat function and make sure that your video is off. We will get an opportunity later on to share in groups. So we would like you to keep the video off until then, and then you can turn both your video and audio on as we begin in the sessions. Okay. Good morning, Andreas. Welcome. You're still on mute.
Solve that. So now I'm there. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you for making the time. We're very honored to have you here.
With pleasure. I just take my earphones, then you can hear me better.
Perfect. Just a reminder also to all other participants, if you are not a speaker, please keep your video off and your audio off, and we will allow everyone to turn their video on and audio on once we get to the breakaway sessions, where you'd be sharing your insights with each other, some questions and some learnings, which will come later on in the session. So I will give you a prompt when we are meant to do that. But for now, please keep your video off and your audio off. You are more than welcome to use the chat box, to interact with each other, to send some questions, to kind of preempt what you would like to hear from us today, from our speakers, and overall the opening plenary and this idea of wicked problems in education. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. It is officially 9:30 in the morning out here in South Africa and in Paris with Andreas. It is early evening for John. Thank you for making the time in the evening to speak to us today. So our opening plenary today is really concerned with this idea of exploring wicked problems in education. And that can be a bit of a mouthful, but we'll kind of allow our experts to delve a bit deeper into this. The annual summit, which would have been held in person somewhere in Pretoria this year, obviously has not happened due to COVID-19 and some of those limitations. But we do insist on driving the conversation forward on issues that matter, and really issues that we are thinking of and exploring this year around this summit is this idea of wicked problems in education. So a wicked problem is considered as a social or cultural problem that is often considered impossible even to solve or quite difficult. One, it's because the knowledge around the problem is often incomplete or even contradictory. Experts don't agree. And you know, when there's a lot of misalignment on even understanding what the issue is, it's highly unlikely that you have very good and solid solutions that everyone can buy into coming into that. But also, there's also the number of people that are affected by the problem is so immense, and the different opinions, that are involved in kind of even understanding what the problem is and how it shapes their realities, the large economic burden that's involved in considering wicked problems and trying to solve for them. And more than anything, I think, just the interconnected nature of the problem, that it's so connected with other issues that feed into it and reinforce it and exacerbate it. Those are some of the things that make wicked problems quite difficult to solve. So why bother? Why even try to go ahead and try to solve wicked problems? It is only because, and simply because, we think that wicked problems are worth solving. So when you think about problems worth solving, those for us are wicked problems. And when you think about the other side, though, of what lies on the other side of a wicked problem is potentially wicked solutions. And that's why we have themed our summit this year, Wicked Possability. So we're looking past the crisis that we are currently in, but also looking past the fact that these problems in education have existed for quite a long time, only just made more clearer perhaps by issues such as the pandemic. If you look at the way in which the Second World War reshaped the education system, you'd be amazed to think that some of the things that we see and take for granted today about the education system were actually shaped from a place of crisis. So we believe very strongly in this idea of wicked possability, and we'll spend today and tomorrow exploring that in depth. Today, largely focusing on these wicked problems. Here's a favorite physical example of mine around a wicked problem and what it is. If this looks familiar, it's the Voynich manuscript, which is really considered by many to be a lot of things. You know, it's quite bewildering. It was discovered in the 1600s or so. Is it on astronomy? Is it a medical book? Is it cosmology? And perhaps most mystifying of all is the script that's used in this. It's not a known language, and possibly some have considered it a hoax. But many people still do believe that it's worth understanding and decrypting this mysterious manuscript. My name, as I have mentioned, is Sihle Ngesi-Magubane, and I am a program officer at Gerwel Fellowship. And the wicked problem that I concern myself with, and largely why I have joined this mission at Gerwel Fellowship, is how we can find young people with high potential and create trajectory accelerating opportunities for them to make an impact as expert teachers, as education leaders, and education entrepreneurs. One of these young people is with us right now. Her name is Sihle Nopuzana, and she will be introducing our speakers today. Thank you, Sihle. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Our first guest speaker today is the Director of Education and Skills of OECD, Andreas Schleicher. He's a physicist, yes, just like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, but not only that, he has a degree in mathematics and statistics. If you think that is impressive, he also speaks 4 different languages and has been honored with numerous awards, such as the Theodor Heuss Prize for exemplary democratic engagement in Germany, his home country. Our next speaker is the Professor of Education and Director at Melbourne Institute Research. He is Professor John Hattie. He is internationally acclaimed for his 2008 book, Visible Learning, which is believed to be the world's largest evidence-based study into the factors which improve student learning. He has also served as a member of the Independent Advisory Group reporting to New Zealand's Minister of Education. In addition to that, he has been honored for his services to education by being appointed as an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit. And our third guest speaker is Ndlovu, who sits as the Dean Fellow at Instil Education. She is currently enrolled for a Doctor of Philosophy in Education at Wits, researching in rural educational pedagogies. The development of rural education in South Africa is what drives her research interests. Not only the educational part, but also the nutritious part, as she sits in and is part of the board of the directors for EPUB Technologies, which aims to provide students with nutritious food. So let's sit back, relax, and get ready to be enlightened.
Thank you very much, Sihle, for that wonderful introduction. Andreas Schleicher, dubbed Sheldon Cooper by our candidate fellow, over to you. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you, and I really admire your mission. I do think really the future of education is with young leaders, and I think curating them and giving them sort of opportunities, I think, is so critical to move forward. Education is a tough problem. I think we can all agree on this. If you just think about how much our world has changed over the last 20 years. When we started our work on assessing learning outcomes in PISA at the OECD in the year 2000, teaching reading was straightforward. Reading was about extracting knowledge from prefabricated sources. And if you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust the answer to be true. That was all straightforward. If you think about reading in the year 2020, if you don't know the answer to a question, you look it up on Google and you find 10,000 answers to your question, and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer just about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. A very different kind of skill set, much harder to teach, much harder to develop. Huge changes in the world shaped through technology, but not just technological innovation, also social innovation. So that's how our world has changed. But if you think, how the skills of people have changed, and I'm talking here about mainly the kind of principal industrialized countries that have spent a lot of money on education. The skills of young people look exactly like they did 20 years ago. Not, maybe their technical skills. Students have learned a lot, but their capacity to manage, access, integrate, evaluate, reflect on information. You've seen no change. If you'd see a line like this on a brain scan, you get very worried. And think about this. When we looked at whether students can reliably distinguish fact from opinion, we found, in 2018, just 1 in 10 students were capable of doing this in a complex context. Now you can say, well, that's better than 7% 20 years ago. But once again, the world has so fundamentally changed. Today, your capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage uncertainty has become so vital for success. You're surrounded by sort of all sorts of information, and you need to sort of navigate this. So that's just an illustration why education truly is a wicked problem. It's very, very hard to change now. And part of the problem is us. The status quo has so many protectors. Sometimes as parents, we are not the answer to the problem. We are the problem. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn things that were very important for us. And we get even more anxious when they do learn things that we no longer understand as parents. Sometimes as teachers, you teach more like how you were taught than how you were taught to teach. And as a minister of education, you can lose an election over education when something small gets wrong. But you're never going to win an election over education because, it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. So your successor will earn the fruits of what you did well. What you did badly, you pay the price directly. So the status quo has many protectors. I think that's one of the fundamental reasons why actually it's so hard to change education. Some people say, it's like moving graveyards. You just can't rely on the people out there to help you. The second part is, the frogs rarely clear the swamp. Basically, there are many vested interests in education. And it's actually quite easy. Sometimes, teachers are part of this themselves. It's very easy. As a teacher, you command a lot more trust than politicians. So actually, if you don't like to implement the ideas the policymakers establish, it's not that difficult. And then there is this asymmetry between the costs and benefits of reform. You want to change something, you've got to pay for it now. You have to, have people get them on your mission to work with you on this. But you're going to see the benefits much later. That's very hard to justify as a policymaker, but also as a practitioner. costs and certain, they're immediate, the benefits are long-term, and sometimes not so clear. It's very, very hard. And it's not just everything. You know, you have a very complex governance system in education, many layers of bureaucracy, you know, the government, the kind of local municipalities, the schools, and they all have their role. And sometimes those roles are not very clearly articulated. And that's where a lot of conflict comes from. What is also clear is that changes in the demands of our societies have vastly outpaced the structural capacity of our education systems to respond to this. The best minister of education in a fast-changing world can no longer solve the problems of, you know, millions of students and hundreds of thousands of teachers and 10,000s of schools. The challenge today is how can we mobilize, find the good ideas in the classroom and scale them and spread them, not how we can push more ideas into classroom from the top. That's basically how society has changed now. And Sihle, you also mentioned the lack of supportive ecosystems. Education is embedded in many other social services. And sometimes, you know, we have seen that in this pandemic very clearly. You know, if you do not have, you know, a supportive parental kind of environment, if you do not have access to technology, once you're kicked out of school, you're going to be in a very difficult place. If you have not learned by yourself, if you had been spoon-fed by your teachers, learning little chunks and bits of knowledge, suddenly in this pandemic, you have to learn at home. If you not master this, you're going to be in a very difficult place. So these are the reasons why it's a difficulty. But let me get to wicked possibilities. You know, actually, you look to China, at least the eastern provinces. 20 years ago, who would have thought that China would be able to build a world-class education system in a very short time? And actually, they succeeded. And now some of the provinces are #1. Look at Singapore, moving from good to great. Look at Estonia. Actually, it's the poorest nation in Europe, and actually the one that has seen consistent improvement, moving up to the frontier. Look to Portugal, Southern Europe, one of the poorer countries, consistently moving up to the average of Poland. So it's not many countries, but you find some at the lower end of the performance spectrum. You can look to Peru. You know, again, there's still a lot of work, or Albania, still a lot of work to do for them to move to the frontier. But you can see actually things are changing, things are moving forward. Or Brazil, you know, maybe you see, well, that's not so impressive, or Turkey. But think about this. When Turkey joined our assessment in 2003, they had only 1/3 of young people enrolled in school. Today, it's 73%. To get a lot more people participating and still improve the quality of education. You take countries like Sweden, you know, was the star performer in education historically, then, you know, made some really big structural mistake in education reform, but fixed them. You know, 2010, 2011, they caught the ball, they turned things around, and you can put things back on track. That's actually why I believe we should look at possibilities. This is not an impossible. We don't have many countries like this, but we have some that show us actually that change is possible. And I want to show you something else, which I think could be really interesting for you also from a South African perspective. Look at the performance gap that you can see here for an average country. I've chosen the Slovak Republic in Europe. The red square is the performance of the 10% most disadvantaged students. The green square is the one of the wealthiest students. They span the world. It's a small country. If you're from a poor family, you do poorly in education. If you're from a wealthy family, you do really well. And some people have, you know, got very accustomed to this. In education, you've become very tolerant to failure. If you run a hospital, you know, you have 20% of people dying in your hospital, you do something about it. In education, we often blame it on the student. We say, well, you know, they don't have, you know, the kind of cultural assets, the social assets, the economic assets. That's why they're doing very well, or talent. But think about this. You take the same disadvantaged students from Portugal, and they do as well as the average student in the Slovak Republic. And you take the 10% most disadvantaged students from the 4 Chinese provinces, and they do pretty much as well as the wealthiest students in the United States and other countries. Poverty is not destiny. Actually, we have some very good examples of countries that have done well about this, that have been able to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, that have been able to align resources with needs. Because it's not just about, you know, investing more money. That's the easy solution. And you know, I would say for South Africa, money would do a lot. You know, South Africa doesn't spend a lot on education, and you spend more and you get more. That's at least what this regression line shows. You know, at the beginning, money makes a lot of a difference. But then, you know, comes a point where actually money alone is no longer taking you further. And that's a very important point. In education, often, it's not just about investing more, it's about investing differently. If you have to make a choice, you know, between a smaller class, which everybody likes, and a better teacher, which everybody likes too, go for the better teacher. Most high-performing education systems have prioritized the quality of teaching, quality of teachers over the size of classes. Vietnam, China, Japan, very large classes, but very, very good teachers. And those spending choices become very, very important. How do you actually attract talented teachers into disadvantaged schools? Well, if you go to China, every high-performing school will be paired with a low-performing school. They will collaborate. The high-performing school might get more resources, but they cannot spend the resources on their own. They need to spend the resources to support a low-performing school to become better. That's how you establish communities of practice that actually work effectively together. So take that with you. You know, money alone is not going to do the trick. It's about, you know, how we invest resources. And the same is true with time. You know, there are enormous differences in the amount of time that students spend learning. In blue, I've marked here the time students spent in school, and in yellow, I've marked the time that students spent learning out of school. Look at the United Arab Emirates. Number one, students spend close to 60 hours learning per week in school, out of school. And then you look at Finland on the other side of this equation, you can see it's a little bit more than half of that, 37 hours. Huge differences in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, you can see in Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Sweden, students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. So once again, it's not just about adding hours. It's about changing the learning experience in the classroom. How do we use that precious resource of student learning time? Those are the really big questions. Now, I've just shown you, you know, money and time are not very good predictors of a system's performance. Here is a good predictor of a system performance. And that's the growth mindset that young people bring with them. We ask students once a very simple question. What do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And you can see in many countries, students said, well, you know, if I'm not very good in mathematics, it's because I don't have that talent and I better study something else. In other countries, you have students saying, well, you know, if I try really, really hard, I know my teacher is going to help me, and I'm going to be successful. And that growth mindset that we can create and shape in education is a better predictor for the quality of an education system than, you know, the money we spend or the time we spend. So growth mindset, you know, one of the kind of factors. Now, and you can see Estonia, #1 in the OECD on outcomes, #1 on the growth mindset. Students are owners of their success. They learn to learn independently. They know actually it's not their social background, it's not their environment, is actually their own kind of effort. And the education system will redouble its effort to help those who are struggling. And you can see actually it's important in other areas as well. You can see students with a stronger growth mindset were more likely to motivate to master challenging tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They had less fear of failure. Now think about the 21st century. Now, if you want your students to be really creative, imaginative, you have to give them room to experiment. And if they experiment, they will take risks, need to take risks. If they take risks, they will make mistakes. If you're not very good in actually helping young people learn and grow from these mistakes, they're not going to become creative. But students with a stronger growth mindset, we're also more likely to establish ambitious learning goals and actually see greater value in school, intrinsic value in school. And think about how important that has been in this pandemic. You know, students who do not see value in school, why would they study at home when they're left on their own devices? And again, you know, you can see we can shape those kinds of attributes of education, predictors of success. There's another dimension you can add to this. You know, Are students happy with their lives? And you can see enormous differences across countries. In Netherlands, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Finland, students seem to be very happy with their lives. In other countries here on the right side, Turkey, Korea, Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei, China, students are not that happy with their lives. And now people, when you look at this chart, you say, well, isn't that, almost the counterpart of performance? Yeah, actually, you have some countries like Korea and China and so on who are very successful academically, but where students are not happy with their lives. And you look at this and you say, well, maybe we have to make a choice. Either we make students happy or they will be very good in school. But actually, you look at other countries, you look at Finland or the Netherlands or Switzerland or Estonia, where you can see students are happy with their lives and they're very good at school as well. So once again, these are they seem to be wicked problems, but there seem to be solutions to them. And actually, we know some of those solutions. Actually, we can see sort of students who were good in school and happy with their lives experienced a high level of teacher support, the best predictor. They had, usually good parental support. They talked with their friends after school, and they were engaged in some physical activity. And where things did not work out, it was typically to do with anxiety with schoolwork or a lot of, playing with a computer. So actually, sometimes those factors are actually also quite evident. But, life satisfaction, people would say often, well, that's about friends and family. It's not a responsibility of school. Schools are about teaching something, not about making students happy. But look at this chart. You can see the disciplinary climate in school has a lot to do with whether students feel happy with their lives. If students feel, there's a secure, safe environment where my teacher is supportive, they were very highly satisfied with their lives. Where they were less exposed to bullying, where they felt a stronger sense of belonging, agency, identity, purpose. Those are actually very important predictors, not just for academic performance, but also for students' life satisfaction, where they felt supported by their teachers, where they felt, there was a cooperative climate among young people. So once again, what seems so wicked at the beginning, actually, when you look at it, there are answers to this. They're not easy answers, but there are answers to this. And if you look towards the future, things are going to get a lot tougher. The kind of things that are easy to teach and maybe easy to test are precisely the kind of things that have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. They're evaporating from our labor markets, from our societies. In some ways, we have become very good in educating second-class robots, people who are very good to repeat what we tell them. But in the time of artificial intelligence, where computers are so much more powerful than humans, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that makes us human? You can see this world of knowledge around us expanding dramatically. With lots of features and facets. And that basically pushes us to think, what do we want to teach? What is it that students want to learn? But the important point that I want to make is that all those features of knowledge are associated with people. Learning is rarely a transactional phenomenon. Learning is always a relational phenomenon. The subjects where you studied hardest in primary school were probably not the subjects where you had some intrinsic, interest in, but they were the subjects where you had a teacher who, understood your dreams, who supported you, who make you sort of see the world through a new perspective. Learning always comes through people. That's also why technology has been so disappointing in the delivery of education so far. Learning is always a relational phenomenon. And compared with that, the tiny work of the school curriculum is just such a limited piece. And we want to fill everything into this little box. But what we often see is that when those rich, beautiful features of our social life end up in the school curriculum, they become very shallow shadows of themselves. I give you an example. When we ask fourth graders, so people in primary school, about their attitudes towards science, they all love science. Science is about observing nature, experimenting, understanding cause and effect, playing with things. When we survey students at age 15, many hate science. Science has become an abstract world of formulas and equations. It actually has nothing to do anymore with the nature of scientific inquiry. Thinking like a scientist, design an experiment, understanding and differentiating questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not. Thinking like an historian. In school, we often teach history in terms of, names and places and people and times. But that's not history. History is about, can you think like an historian? Do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes? Can you think like a mathematician? We teach young people, how to calculate an exponential function. Well, computers can do that so much better than humans. We don't teach young people enough to understand the idea, the nature of an exponential function. If we did a better job with this, we would have sent 10,000 doctors to fight the kind of corona pandemic when it broke out, not 100. The idea of an exponential function is foreign to our natural experiences. Time is linear, space is linear. We're very comfortable in those spaces. The mathematical world opens up new windows into different ways of thinking. But we're not very good at that in school. Instead, we're putting more and more and more and more things into this tiny box. Well, again, in a world of artificial intelligence, we need to think much harder about what makes us human. Ethics. Artificial intelligence is a great amplifier and a great accelerator. It accelerates good ideas and good practice, and it accelerates bad ideas and bad practice. In the same way, our capacity to distinguish what is right, what is wrong, is the human capacity. But often, we're not very good at that in school. We teach young people the established wisdom of our times. We don't teach them how to question the established wisdom of our times. The realm of political and civic life, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, and design, all those big questions of humanity. They are the answers to the wicked problems of our times, not to make people compatible with the ways of thinking of computers, because computers are going to be so much better than humans on this. So basically, how do you actually do this? The question is not just, the what, but often the how. What we know is that, top-down initiatives that are led by government rarely change things on the ground. It's never programs that scale, initiatives. It's always culture that scales. Culture is actually about people working together. It's about leadership. It's about, bringing people together. If you want to, move things really forward, don't ask yourself how many people like your ideas, how many people support your ideas. Ask yourself how well your people can collaborate. Now, that's the big answer to those kinds of questions. Knowledge is only as valuable as our capacity to do something with it. Now, what you can see is, and I showed you that at the beginning, the road of educational reform is littered with so many good ideas that were poorly implemented. So let me conclude with just, a few thoughts on how do we address these wicked problems of our times. Well, in the industrial age, it was very clear we could teach people something. Today, it's about giving them very strong ways of thinking, ways of walking. If you can think like a scientist, if you can think like an historian, if you can think like a philosopher, if you understand the nature of the disciplines, you'll be able to master the knowledge of your times, not of the past. That's, I think, one of the most fundamental prerequisites. Teaching fewer things at greater depth, rather than making our learning world a mile wide and an inch deep. The second part is, in the past, it was enough to educate a few people well, because our economies only needed. There are very few people who are very talented. Today, we need everybody to succeed. And actually, what I've tried to show you at the beginning is that's not an abstract dream. Actually, it's something that education can deliver on. The idea that actually do decouple social background and learning outcomes. But of course, it requires a very different caliber of teachers. In the past, we used to tell teachers exactly what to teach and how to teach. We made learning very prescriptive. We had a very industrial way of organizing teaching. Well, that was good for a static world where you could teach teachers once for their lifetime. Today, school should not just be a place where students learn. School should be a place where everybody learns, every day new, where you reinvent the world every day new, where you have teachers who spend a lot of time, not just, delivering ideas, but also developing ideas. And once again, when you look at this around the world, whether it is Estonia and Finland in Europe, or China, Vietnam in Asia, teachers there teach less, actually a lot less than a teacher in South Africa, but they actually work more hours than a teacher in South Africa. So what do they do in the rest of their time? Well, they work with other teachers to design innovative learning environments. They do research projects. They work with individual students outside the classroom setting. They work with the families of the students. The teachers there are not just good instructors. They're also great coaches, great mentors, great facilitators, great evaluators. They are social engineers, they're social workers, they're psychologists. They are not just, delivering mathematics and science. They have a lot of time and space to fulfill other roles, to own their professional practice in a way which is so important. And again, that has to do with the work organization. This kind of factory style of work makes us, hostile to change. And that's true in every industry. If you have workers on an assembly line, they will not even think about their workplace because they know only this tiny space in which they've plugged. They will not think about how to improve productivity because they are just piece of a big machine. If you have a more flat, collegial, entrepreneurial environment where you create more room for change, well, I think you'll see more change. Once again, if you're a teacher in China and you have a really interesting idea, you just write to the government and they're going to give you pretty easily a grant to actually try that idea out. Actually for individuals at the front line, it's possible to become entrepreneurs, innovators. And actually, if you find out that your idea is, working at the end of the school year, they will not say it's right or wrong. They will say, well, show us that you can actually replicate this idea in 10 other schools with other people, with other places. So you are suddenly at the front line, not only to imagine, but also to do and to demonstrate them. And of course, ultimately, that's also a question of our accountability cultures, moving. We are often, shifting information upwards in the education system, from the teacher to the school leader, from the school leader to the administrator. I think we have to become a lot better to look outwards to the next teacher, to the next, school, and I also believe to the next country. So think across, we often think about education as still a very domestic field of policy. We have to benefit more, I believe, from the ideas and ways of thinking of other cultures, other countries around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Perhaps the most inspiring moment for me as you are speaking and as you're unpacking how these wicked problems in education do look like, that you've provided quite a strong data-driven case that, look, if we have the right data and we use it the right way, it's not about adding more money, it's not about spending more time, but it's about fixing the value drivers, the things that actually make a change. And the more we kind of adopt that mentality, the more we adopt that rigor in terms of exploring and expanding our knowledge around understanding the issue for what it is, instead of what has been or what we wish it could be. So thank you very much for that. Before I let you go, there is one question that I will take from Madeline Schoeman. You had mentioned around sort of like this idea of a growth mindset. And Madeline would like to know, how do you deal with wishful thinking as opposed to a growth mindset? So the idea is that learners do not always get what it takes to grow. They don't quite grasp it. So how would you navigate around that?
Yeah, thanks, Madeleine. I think that's a great question. I do believe the big differentiator is really, wishful thinking is about complacency. You let 1,000 flowers bloom and, everybody dream, and then you don't do anything about it. Growth mindset actually is a very tough environment. You give student opportunity, you let them experiment, but you have to understand where things do work and where things do not work out. And you have to actively learn from failure. You develop self-efficacy, the capacity of students to address really tough problems. The worst thing we can do, and that's about, wishful thinking, is to make things easier when things get tough. Sometimes as educators, we have this inclination, oh, here's a student coming from a poor background, and so let's make things easier. Actually, that's not what you see in high-performing education systems. What they do is actually they keep the bar very high, but they redouble their support. You know, they will actually invest whatever it takes to help you overcome the problem. So they develop that sense in the student. Well, even if the problem looks insurmountable, I will get the support. I find the resources in myself and an environment around me to solve those problems. That's for me the real big difference. And often we'd call growth mindset, which in fact is just for us an easy way to sort of encourage wishful thinking. Growth mindset requires a very demanding environment, a lot of individual support, and a very good culture of feedback and appraisal.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you for making the time and spending this wonderful, wonderful time and insight with us. I will then invite John Hattie to start addressing us. Andreas, I know that you had needed to step away. So
thank you very much.
This is not goodbye, it's a tiny break. We'll engage again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sihle, for inviting me here today, because in many ways it's kind of a coincidence. I did not know what Andreas was going to talk about, and so you're going to see there's a bit of an overlap between what we're talking. But I also want to start where he started, and congratulating you and the Jack Gerwel team for investing in what matters. I'm a great fan of the notion that it is not my job to talk about the future. It is not my job to define what the future is. That is the role of teachers, and it's the role of students. The students are going to define their future, and so we have to treat them today that they are the ones who are going to define the future of the world, that we know it. So we better treat them in a way that we want to treat, they want them to treat us, and that is a really important reciprocal notion. But the wicked problem I want to address is very similar. We know the current model of schooling kind of works for many, but far from all. Oh my goodness, do we have evidence? We have evidence coming out of everywhere. The days of evidence surely are over. And so, if we know all this evidence and we want to improve the current model of schooling, the wicked problem for me is about scaling up success. And it follows very nicely for what Andreas was talking about, but I want to come to it from a slightly different perspective. And I, like him, am very optimistic that the future is in the hand of teachers and kids. All we have to do at times is get out of their way, almost. I want to start with the evidence. And what started me on this journey many, many years ago was, firstly, my background is like Andreas. I'm a measurement statistician person. And so I came into education from kind of the outside, even though I have taught in real schools. I taught at universities too, so I count that as teaching. And what struck me is every single teacher I met could tell me how to improve kids' learning. Every politician can tell me. Every parent can tell me. And what's more, every academic. And every one of those people have the same claim. They have evidence. And it normally is, just come and watch me. Or here's some examples of kids' work. Now, pause and think. It doesn't make sense. You went to school, you know it doesn't make sense. But how come in this business, everybody has the answer and everything seems to work? So I said, well, is that the case? And I wanted to look at all the different studies that have been done, all the different influences that have been done, and put them along this continuum. And I try to identify those that enhance learning, those that have a zero effect, and obviously those have a decreased effect. And when I started this, I expected to be quite a lot in the decreased, because everybody can tell you what's wrong with education in South Africa. So you expect a lot down there. So away I went. And I collected, and 10 years ago I had 800, now I've got 1,600 meta-analyses. I have 250 million students in the sample. Now I'm close to 250 to 300 influencers, and I would argue it's a pretty good sample size. And when you look at that 250 million students, this graph always amazes me. Look at the red zone. Those are the things that we do to students that harm them. And there's not much down there. Indeed, quite a bit of what's in that red zone makes perfect sense. Like the effect size of bullying is minus 0.3. The effect size of boredom, minus 0.5. And when you take those kind of make sense ones into account, 95 to 98% of things that we do to students enhances their learning. All you need to enhance learning is a pulse. And this is why I have never met a teacher who says they're below average. I've never met a school leader, a principal, a politician, a reporter who doesn't have the answer with evidence. Of course they do, if this is the scenario. We've got to stop saying what works. And we've got to start saying what works best. Because look at the blue zone. That's the zone above the average across the 300 million kids, 0.4. The number doesn't matter today. What matters, there's a lot of schools and teachers in that blue zone now. And the visible learning model of schooling is, can we identify those teachers and schools that are already in that blue zone, form a coalition of success around those, and invite those in the yellow zone to join. And my challenge to every one of you, as you go through your program and your training and go out to schools, where are you? If you're in that blue zone, permission to keep doing what you're doing, almost. If you're in that yellow zone, you're doing damage. Those kids in the blue zone, their students are gaining more than a year's growth for a year's input. And that's impressive. Yellow zone, it's not. And like Andreas said, many schools, you will find teachers in that blue zone, and down the corridor, you'll find teachers in the yellow zone. Same curriculum, same principal, same system, same kinds of kids, same kind of background. Don't tell me it's those reasons. And that's giving you a huge hint as to what's the common denominator in the blue, because that's what fascinates me. What is the common in the blue that is separate from what's in the yellow? And that's what took me 15 years to write that book. Let me look. Today, I don't have the time to go into all the detail, but there is a website. It's a free one. You can look it up on your iPhone. You can look it up on the internet. If you want to find out any one of those 300 influencers, if you want all the data, it's all there. And you can see the various components that I look at, from the home, from the kids, from the school, from the teacher, curriculum, you name it. And the reason I put that data out there is simple. Yes, people criticize my work, and it's usually about some data problem. And I'm saying, wait. No one, since I started, has taken the data and came up with a different explanation to the one that I want to present. I know someone's going to have to spend 30 years to collect the data. Well, you don't anymore. I'm giving you the lot, and I update it every now and then. That's it. That's not my message today. I want you to look at these ones and take a moment and say, which ones of those do you think are in the blue zone, above average? Which are in the yellow zone? And yes, there are a couple in the red zone. If you don't know what it means, skip over it.
Make a guess and say that probably around diversity of student body that's sitting on the blue zone, probably lack of sleep billing, single sex schools could probably be on the red zone.
Okay. None of them. And I put it to you, the majority of things on that table are the things that we talk about in classrooms, in staff rooms, in the newspapers, amongst the politicians. Now, don't get me wrong. Those that are positive, yes, they're positive. But I want to make the point that they are tiny. And we've got to stop the politics of distraction and going and spending, investing an enormous amount of money and time and effort and people's belief systems in the things that don't matter much. And I want you to contrast those tiny numbers with the next slide, because most of those are structural things. Changing curricula, changing assessment, changing the way in which we structure schools. But look at that compared to that. Oh my goodness. when you look down the top 7 things that underline all that's in the blue zone, what is fascinating is it's all about expertise. There is not a single kid thing in there. It doesn't matter what the kid is. And one of the criticisms of my work is people say, oh yeah, but my kids are different. Come to the school, it's different. Well, of course your class of kids is different and unique. But this message says what works best with kid A works best with kid B. What works best in Victoria, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, New York, Pretoria, you name it. It's not the kid, it's these things. And I know that upsets people because we always like to think we're unique. But I challenge you to come up with a set of analysis that shows that this doesn't apply. And these things collectively double and triple the rate of learning. When teachers work together and ask the question about their impact, and I'll come back to that because that word impact is going to be very critical. And of course that impact's a function of high expectations. If you think a year's growth is tiny and the teacher in the next room thinks a year's growth is large, I will assure you that both those teachers will be extremely successful at having low, sadly, or having high. Your expectation of what a year's growth was. Making those expectations explicit to the students by making sure then that they are complicit in this journey of reaching expectations. And what's fascinating, if we have the time to go in it, the effect size of student expectations is 4 times higher than the expectations of the teachers, which are already high. Kids come in, and Andreas touched this with his growth mindset. And my language is, what do the kids expect to achieve? And many of the kids are told from day one, because they're from a poor background, they can't achieve. They have 1,000 reasons why they're told they can't achieve. Now, don't ever think that kids don't hear those messages. I was brought up in quite a small country town and small remote part of the world. No one told me that my father was a shoemaker and I therefore was not expected to achieve. Today I would have been told 1,000 ways. How do we make that explicit? How do we get this Goldilocks principle of challenge, the Goldilocks story where not too hard, not too easy, not too boring? And therein lies the art of teaching. 50%, as Graham Nuttall showed, 50% of what is taught in every class, the kids know already. The biggest problem in school is it becomes too easy and it becomes boring. How do you know? And the art is what may be challenging for you may not be challenging for the next person. And how do you do that in an environment that has high trust and high relationships between the teacher and the student and between the student and the students? But the thing to remember is trust isn't important. Trust is a mechanism. Building that relationship is because then errors are welcomed. Kids do not come to school to learn that which they already know. They come to learn that which they don't know. And I go into classes in my work in visible learning. One of the questions we ask the students, what does it mean to be a learner in this class? And I invite you to ask that of your students when you go into a school. And if they say things like, oh, a good learner is someone who comes well prepared, sits up straight, does the work, and watches the teacher work. Well, that's not a good learner. That's compliance. A good learner loves the struggle of learning, knows that they want to go and challenge, and being challenged means they could be wrong. A good learner has the opportunity to think aloud and speak aloud. Similarly, I ask you to go into a class and ask the student, what do they do when they don't know what to do? The majority of kids say they put their hand up. Watch them. No, they don't. The only kids who put their hands up are the kids who know the answer. It's making an environment where every kid can be challenged and not know. How do we maximize that feedback to the teacher about their impact? And I say that specifically because so much assessment in schools we think is about the student. No, it's about the teacher. And if you don't believe me, the next time you give an assessment, ask the kids before they do the assignment to put what grade they're going to get. By age 8, they know. They don't learn much from tests. But oh my goodness, you can learn about your impact, about what impact you had, about what, for whom, which students you had that impact, and what's that magnitude. of that impact and that relentless focus on learning. I do not care less how any of you teach. I think we've had a major distraction by talking about how to teach. I don't care how you teach. I care about the impact of your teaching. And so my theme is from 300 million kids is how do you see learning through the eyes of the student? Don't talk to other teachers about how you teach. Talk to other teachers about the impact of your teaching. And that bottom line, now Andreas talked about this in terms of students having these skills of self-regulation, lifelong learning, metacognition. I think it's easier to say. I want students to see themselves as their own teachers. I want them to know what to do when they don't know what to do. And what I struggle with is my own granddaughter, who's age 4 and about to start school. She's excellent at teaching me and teaching others. Sadly, by age 8, she will learn it's not her job anymore. It is the fundamental outcome of schooling. And so when I look at the current model, about 80% of the students, I would argue, teach a particular grammar of schooling that I want to talk about. 20% aim for the U. And if you want a really excellent book to read, look at Larry Cuban's History of How to Teach. He argues that over the last 150 years, if Rip Van Winkle came back today, he could walk into a classroom in South Africa and he could teach as he taught 150 years ago. You couldn't do that with an iPhone. I think Alexander Bell would have a bit of a strange reaction if he saw what a phone looked like today. And when I say 80% for it's working, 80% have worked out how to do it. They're not happy. Take the Jenkins curve. Think of my 4-year-old, Emma. 95% of kids, kindergarten and year 1, want to come to school to learn. By the end of primary school, it's down to 37%, 1 in 4. Oh my goodness. What do we do in this thing called school that turns kids off this thing called learning? And every teacher and every principal, I would argue, should know where their kids fall on the Jenkins curve, this curve here. Because this is the thing. If you have 2 out of 3 kids in your class that don't want to be there, your chances of making an impact on them are pretty minimal. So that's a pretty good thing. How do we make schools inviting places for kids to want to come and learn? Then I look at the employment sector, and this is the employment rates in the USA from 1980 to kind of recent. And what's fascinating about this is students with high maths, and you can put your favorite subject there, science, history, panel beating, you name it, and they have high social skills, are extremely employable. No surprise, low maths, low social skills are not. Then I look at the one that I find is the most interesting. Those students who have lower in the content area, but have higher social skills are employable. And those who have higher in the content area and lower social skills are not. What employers are asking for now, it's not a future, this is now, they're asking for us in schools to develop not only content, but team players, collaborators, translators, people who have social sensitivity. I ask you when you go to a school next, are your students sitting there working alone? Or more often, are they sitting in groups working alone? Is the assessment about the student? How do we teach those skills? And as one of you asked, Alistair, I think it was in the questioning, it's not about one or the other. It's not about being an historian or teaching content. It's about both. And I look at, for instance, Singapore, and I look at their maths program and ask, why was it in the year 2003? They dramatically changed their maths program from high content area, the basics, the facts, where they were #1 in the world. And they changed it such that they stay #1 in the world. What they did is they abolished the concept of basics and said, from age 5, maths is about problem solving. And to do problem solving, you need basics. And what they did is they narrowed the content to allow the schools to go deeper. It's not about either or, folks, it's both. I want to see your students develop high social skills as well as content, not just the content by itself. So the current grammar schooling, we've just done a study with 17,000 teachers, and we analysed what percentage of time do you talk in your class? 89% on average. You talk a lot. I'm an academic, probably 100%. We ask around 150 to 250 questions a day. 90 to 95% of them are about the facts. They require less than 3 words response from the students. We see the students as recipients and we slice and dice them. We slice and dice the curriculum. We differentiate, we sort, we track, we segregate, we group, we bound. And it kind of works. And here's the conspiracy. Kids above the average want you to do more of this. Parents want you to do more of this. Politicians love you doing this because they can measure it and see it. Really? Is that what we need if we're going to get the kind of things we need for employment now? I want a new grammar schooling. And you've seen the data. 50, 60% of teachers are up in that blue zone. And when I look at what those teachers are doing, I see more of the new grammar schooling than the current dominant grammar schooling. I see students thinking aloud. I see students interpreting, and paraphrasing, and reasoning. I see that balance between the teacher talk and the student talk at different times much more different. I see exams that inform teachers. And what keeps me going in this business as I travel the world, well, not at the moment, but when I was traveling the world, is the excellence that I see out there. And my argument is, please don't go out there and find failure and fix it. Go out there and find success and scale it up. There's plenty out there. And I visited your country. I've been to Pretoria and parts of your country. I've seen some stunning teachers. I went out to Malamudi and I saw some stunning teaching. Maybe not enough of it, but that within school variance is our biggest problem. And that's what we need to identify that. And my worry is, do we have the courage to identify excellence and scale it up? Do we have the courage to realize that it is expertise that matters? And in the Western world at the moment, we are absolutely dominating our system with amateurs. We put teacher aides and teacher assistants in that have a 0 to negative impact on the kids. There's now more teaching assistants in schools in England than there are teachers. Everyone loves them, but they have no effect. We must invest in expertise. So my wicked problem is, how do we scale up success? And I now work in around about 10,000 schools a year with my visible learning program. And I think it's all about the implementation, Deva. My friend Michael Fullen said about Victoria here in Australia, where I live. He said, we have the best education policies in the world, just not implemented. How do we get that implementation in the class, in the school, and in the system? I've developed a model that we use in our work. We spend a lot of time on diagnosis. So often, particularly you as teachers, you've got a favorite intervention, you've got a favorite program, so you implement it. What if it didn't fit the problem that it had? What if it wasn't going to address what the problem is in the class? And we don't do enough diagnosis. We rush to intervention. Then I want to talk about the implementation. Evaluation, the last phase, is easy. If you get the diagnosis right, you do it at the end. And there's a paper there. Some people didn't like my acronym, Teachers Are to Die For. So there's another one called GOLD. You want to go and see it's the same thing. Here, for example, is what we did in one jurisdiction here in Australia, in the Northern Territory. It's our poorest part of the country, economically extremely poor, very remote. The average tenure of a teacher or a school leader in a school is 8 months. It's hard work. Now, there's 400 schools in the Northern Territory. I'm just giving you, on each line is a school. We go out in the diagnosis phase and we ask the school to do a diagnosis based on about 16 different dimensions and say, is it established practice, exist in pockets, or commonplace? And you can see there, when we started, the schools themselves rated themselves pretty bad. And so then we said to them, okay, let's look at that second school on that line that has 2 3s, 2 commonplace. What are you doing? What's working? What's going on in your school? Tell us how you're thinking. So we recognized some excellence and we started building that. The first year, everyone wanted to talk about what they did. They did spiders and snakes, or they did Aboriginal culture, or they did sand surfing. It was just all about what they did, which was a hopeless scenario. But once they started talking to each other and given the distance, it was all on social media. That's what happened within 3 years. Dramatic change in the whole system because they changed the debate from what they did to what was their impact of what they did. And when I look at that, we know we can scale up, and we can do that within 3 years if we change the debate of what we do. We also, I have a political job here in Australia as a federal government has the agency, they own one agency called the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leaders, and I have the grandiose responsibility for being responsible for the quality of teachers, school leaders, and initial teacher education in Australia. We also have the job of esteeming teachers, which is a great job to have. And one of the things we've learned is teachers are incredible big users of social media. And so we work with 1/3 teachers a month come to our site. We have discussion pages. And my point to you is this is part of the answer. We know kids are doing it. I know that teachers can do it. I ran a Twitter night in New South Wales at 7:30 one Tuesday night. We had 100,000 people on it. Teachers are prepared to look at it. Let me give you one example. And this example is induction. We know from our surveys in Australia that 95% of principals claim they have an excellent induction program for new teachers. 95%, of which less than 40% of the teachers know about. Improving induction programs by principals is a futile gesture. So we created an app. And if you go on that app, a brand new teacher can go on there. In the morning, they can ask a question. I'm teaching a play today and I don't know what to do. Or I've got this child and I'm having troubles, etc. By the afternoon, 10 to 12 highly accomplished or lead teachers have responded to that teacher, made a connection, phoned them up, gone on a Zoom. 30,000 a month do this. And here's the interesting thing. There is now more induction in a school run by teachers in other schools than it is run by the principal in their own school. That building communities about expertise is the way to fast track and upscale. If this was a group of people that had been teaching for 10 to 20 years and they were in that blue zone, they're probably in that blue zone because they did it themselves. That is not what the new generation want. That's not what you should expect to wait 10 or 20 years and hope like hang that you can build it yourself. How do you build communities? And I invite you, and I know this is one of the purposes of your foundation, when I look around the world and say, who is providing the resources for teachers in their first 3 years out? No one. No one anywhere. You're left to sink or swim. Build a community. No matter where you end up in South Africa, build a community. Talk to each other. Think aloud. As Andreas said, if I put in an ethics application to introduce my new model of schooling, and I said, I'm going to close every school in the world. I'm going to close down the current grammar of schooling and force teachers not to talk. I'm not going to have teachers direct kids and have them in front of them and push them to work. I would never been given permission. But that's the world we're in at the moment. So right at the moment, I cannot believe a better time to deal with that wicked problem of how do you scale up success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was super insightful and quite reassuring also to kind of understand that there are a lot of elements that don't seem quite obvious. You spoke about professional induction, you spoke about community, which is something we are very excited to start building with our fellows once they go into schools, because those first 3 years in the classroom are tough. And valuing expertise is what I'll come out with quite powerfully here. So that teacher expertise lies at the very heart of ensuring student success. After all, we are about nurturing expert teachers that embrace innovation and lead change. Thank you very much. And now I will call on Annie to give us her perspective from the South African point of view.
Greetings, everyone, and thanks to John and Andreas for laying the foundation for us this morning. Before I get into more of the academic, technical, educational aspects as John and Andreas started, I'm going to contextualize it a little bit into our South African context. when people look at me, for instance, they think, oh, wow, you were destined for greatness. You were destined to succeed. You were destined to be a good teacher. You were destined to be in this space. But I actually come from those wicked problems. I emerged like, like a bird coming out of the ashes of these wicked problems we're talking about in education. I grew up in Diepsloot, a township. Everyone, when you hear Diepsloot, everyone just shivers. It's notorious. It's one of those townships in South Africa that no one wants to go to. I grew up there, and one of my dreaded times were winter times, where for 3 months you had no electricity. But nevertheless, I had to still complete my homework. I still had to do my work for school. And usually that time is your exam time. So it meant sitting with a candle, whatever you could find to study and do your exams. And I think this could probably, a lot of the people in the participants today could relate to. So that's where I come from. And it was through that where my family, my parents, who had a high esteem of knowledge and love for education, no matter what, they wanted to make sure that we don't go through what they went through and be educated. So they made sure no matter what, we will be educated. So in my high school, I got a scholarship, which was very unlikely. I think even the school that gave me the scholarship was a bit shocked that how are we going to manage with this child who comes from a township? So the context didn't change. The only thing that changed was the space where I was getting my education from. So I moved from a farm township school to a elite Joburg school, one of the top 10 in the world, in the country. But none of the things about my identity changed. So I was still going through the same, no electricity in winter with much higher expectations. And even worse, I was that girl who was known to carry a hockey bag in a taxi and try and navigate it through the taxi every single day. I come home at 7 o'clock and no one understands why my school finishes so late. So I come from that. And it was from there where I decided I wanted to be a teacher, because most of as a grade 9 child, a learner, most of my Saturdays was spent teaching all the kids in our street, because their parents were either somewhere in a tavern or didn't come home for that evening. And my parents worried about the kids in the neighborhood. So I would sit and actually tutor them and do their homework. My mom will wash the clothes. We'll make sure they are fed. And so that by Monday morning, they all have their work done. And my dad then inspired me, because I honestly didn't want to be a teacher. That was not the first option. I wanted to be a scientist. I love science. I love chemistry. And through the connections was that I can intern and see if really this is the career I want to pursue. And I have to say, it was my worst experience ever. I went to all these firms and interned there, and it was the worst experience. There was no human interaction. And I came back being like, Dad, I don't think I want to be an engineer ever. And my dad said, since you still love sciences and mathematics and everything, why don't you think of teaching? You're doing it so well. You've been doing it all your, I've seen you as a child just teaching your dolls, teaching the neighbors. Do science and teach science. And that's when I enrolled. I did enroll for physics and engineering, but I decided my first choice then became teaching. And I chose engineering. I decided to challenge myself and say, everyone wants to be a math teacher. Everyone wants to be a science teacher. I would choose to be a technology and engineering teacher. And when I started the teaching degree, it was known as Technica. So it was more technical education. So there I was, one of 3 females in our class to do engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, graphics and drawing, which I've never done in my entire life. There I was at varsity doing this. And it was through my university as becoming a teacher where I started realizing how deep the wicked problems are in our education. When I went to do I interned and did electives in our rural and farm schools, which, you know, a lot of us sit here in Joburg and we think, oh wow, most schools are well off. And even in 2020, we still have schools that are run under trees in South Africa, you know, 26 years, 27 years after our democracy. But we still have schools that are multi-grade, where I had to teach 2 grades in one classroom. And I'm talking about this in like 10 years ago, 8 years ago. It's like really recent, where this is the situation in our education system. So after that, I did go and teach, and I taught at school, and I taught at a private school, because they were looking for technology teachers back then. And the first thing that I noticed was none of the parents and none of the teachers expected a Black woman to be a technology teacher or a science teacher. The expectation was that a Black woman is there to teach isiZulu, is there to teach an African language, is there to teach, you must be in the humanities, but not in the sciences. And my first year of teaching, as Don had pointed out, was the worst, because I was challenged every corner. I was even asked if I'm actually qualified to be a technology teacher, because I unraveled everything that the teachers in their primary school have done with the learners, and I brought what it means to be an engineer. I allowed the learners to see themselves as architects in the classroom. I allowed them to be electrical engineers in the classroom. And that was like, but why am I doing this to girls? Why am I teaching girls to do boys' work? And I'm thinking, but what's the technology has no gender. That was the sort of the challenges I experienced in my first year of teaching. And it was then, I taught for like 3-5 years in the school, but it was during that time I realized, I don't think I'm making the impact that I had when I was that grade 9 child. And I decided then I'm going to leave being in the classroom. I'm going to pursue my postgraduate studies and become a full-time student. I don't know whether that was a good or a bad idea, but I'm currently doing my PhD in education, and I decided to specialize in rural education. And it was because of that has brought me to Instil education. It was through that love of thinking differently and reimagining what education should be like in South Africa, in Africa, that has drawn me to Instil. In that, when I read through the Instil missions and visions, I was like, yes, this is the type of teacher education institution I want to be in. After 10 years of being in the traditional university, you realize that universities don't promote, not all of them, but they get to a point where to think differently, to think creatively, to be creative is not promoted. There's still a way of wanting to make you fit into a certain box, to fit in a certain way of thinking. And I realized some of the ideas that I was implementing in my lecturing classes was a bit abnormal, both for the lecturers and for my students. And I decided to challenge myself, and I decided to say, okay, let me take up a job here at Instil. And because they believe that, you know, feedback is very important, more or less what Don has highlighted about what makes good teacher education and builds good teaching, is that, you know, after working for 5-6 years in rural schools, you realize teaching is happening. People are doing something. There is learning taking place, but the question is that impactful teaching? And that's where, you know, we need to base our teacher education at that level. So with Instil promotes that, you know, teachers, lecturers, we must be more facilitators. We must be there to guide learning. You must always be questioning, you must always be innovative, you must always be creative. So if we do that with our student teachers, the hope is that they will have that ripple effect to not be scared of boundaries and replicate that with learners in the classroom. So whatever we do as teacher education institutes should be what encourages our own teachers to not do what we are doing, but actually exceed what we are doing. And one of the things is that we want failure is okay. As you said, failing is good, I had to learn that as someone who deems themselves as a perfectionist, that failing is learning. Through failure, I can learn and I can actually do better than what I did. It helps me with my data. I use that as evidence of my learning, of how to improve my own learning. And that's one of the things that we are also looking at, to say, let's move away from traditional ways of doing teacher education, the way by imparting knowledge. Let's give our young cohort of teachers a space where they can take risks, where they can question, where they can try out things, where they can be innovative. Let's give them spaces, in resources where they can be innovative, and then ask themselves if this is actually a good practice. And one of the other things we really strive for at Instil is that we use evidence, as you were saying. Let's use the data, let's use evidence, let's use what has been researched. As someone, as a researcher myself, I really value that. Something I've learned was that how data is everywhere in your classroom as a teacher. It's not only the statistics that we get from the universities. Every aspect of your classroom can be a form of data. So how learners react when you ask certain questions, that is a point of evidence of how I can interrogate that. And so we're really striving that teacher education should be a space like that. We really want people to really love what they're doing, to really love teaching, to really have a passion for teaching. And I know it's always contested that, oh, you know what, talking about passion, talking about that, people have to be committed to the profession. As much as you might want to do it for the money, do it for whatever reasons, there should be a level of commitment that comes from someone who decides they want to be a teacher. And one of those things is at Instil is to get our teachers to question who is the child, who is the learner. Get them to interrogate these questions. What is learning? How do I learn? What is my conception of teaching? What is my conception of learning? So that they can understand that themselves and be able to understand how then their own children in the classroom will be learning. And especially in South Africa, diversity, multilingualism, multiculturalism is a big issue that teachers have to grapple with. In Gauteng, I'm Zulu speaking, but the school I teach at speaks Tswana, but the kids come from a Tswana community.
Yes.
And now I'm expected to sort of work with all of this diversity at the end of the day, looking at the knowledge. And this is where I come in from my own personal perspective, which is, let's forget about the subjects for now. Teach our learners to think. Teach our teachers to think. Teach people to understand how to work with knowledge, irrespective of what it is. And I'm blessed to come from some of those, that teaching at, even from a traditional institution, where I can step in a geography classroom, even if I'm not a geography specialist, but I can work with the knowledge. I'm able to bring all the resources that I've acquired over the years and look at the knowledge and say, how do I bring this to be reality to the learners in my classroom? So I really want to leave everyone with that, to say, and I know in South Africa we have to grapple with all this, but that's where the solution is. The possibility is in the problems. It's for you to think about the problem differently, to say, here's a problem, I don't have resources. How do I use my environment, my community as a resource? And like I say, I've learned a lot of that from working in rural schools, where I've invited some parents of kids to come and share certain experiences that could be valued knowledge for my learners. Where I've seen a teacher buying a chicken, a live chicken, and using it in a biology classroom for dissection. You know, so we all think about the fancy things to do. And the reality was like, we do this in our communities every single day. We kill the chicken, we dissect it, and we cook it. So why not bring it inside the classroom and use it as a resource? Using African games like Umrabaraba as a way of working with numbers, place values in the classroom. using the keto, a type of traditional African game where you are counting in, you're going in basis of 1, 2, 5, whatever. Using that as a system to use for place values. I've used that technique. I've used that game to teach place values in mathematics with grade 6 learners. And that is looking to the environment and the community as a positive resource than it being a problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Annie. What a powerful story, and a tiny lesson there for the biology teachers to do bring the chickens into the classroom for dissection, because it's a useful skill in some communities. So thank you very much for that. I will take a question that seems to be quite pressing on the chat. And the question originally comes from Duduma Kari. And she's asking, what are the measures of success for impactful teaching? John?
Look, as I responded to, I think it was to Jenny in there, is your concept of impact is what matters most, because that's what affects your children the most. And I think it's a lot easier to ask the question about impact and how you measure it than it is to ask the question, how do you measure teaching? And you measure the impact, one way is how the students think, how they talk, and how they think aloud. This notion of how they're engaged in learning. And as Andreas said as well, can they think like an historian, like a biologist as they're cutting up a chicken, as they're doing it? Do we give them the chance to think aloud? Can we hear them? Because I call it visible learning. Ironically, in one way, thinking is not visible. But you just have to shut up, guys, and let them talk. That's one way. Absolutely, you should be using tests and measurement. I think this notion that year 12 exams don't matter is nonsense. But that's one part. I also think that it's about the nature of the questions that the students ask. And another way is classroom observation. Never go into a class and observe a teacher teaching, but go into class and help a teacher observe their impact. Like 80% of what happens in your class, you don't see or hear, which is I have very little time for your teacher reflection. And so my point is those 4 measures from the kids, how they think, the questions they ask, the observation, their assignment in the test, that's how you know your impact. Then you have to ask how many of your students are getting the kind of impact you want. And then you have to ask, is that impact sufficient? And this is where we do use effect size and progress measures. So it's the triangulation of those. What you cannot do is you can't depend on your judgment alone. You have to triangulate that judgment. And it's a lot easier to measure your impact than it is to measure teaching.
Thank you, John. It is a lot easier to measure your impact than it is to measure teaching. And do not bring assessors into your classroom to observe your teaching, but rather your impact. Thank you very much. That is quite powerful. Now we have some questions for you. We will just take a few minutes to go into breakaway rooms. And these are the 3 questions really that we'd like you to consider there. So this is an opportunity to just go in and share a bit. Do take a screenshot, keep those questions on the side somewhere. We will be also broadcasting them in the groups. The questions are, first question is, with limited resources, should we prioritize reducing class sizes, freeing up teacher time, or other things than teaching or raising teacher quality and pay? So other things than teaching, what is it that we can prioritize with limited resources? Second question, how do we balance investments in equity and excellence in education? The third question is, how do we design meaningful assessments to serve the purpose of transparency and accountability, but don't lead to narrowing teaching? So I'll keep those questions up here for a bit. And Julian has also posted them on the chat. You will be redirected into the different breakout rooms, and you will have a few minutes, 5 minutes, to go and have a chat, discuss, share some ideas, and then we'll come back into the main room and wrap up.
Hi, George.
Hi, Julian.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. All masked up. I see you not masked up.
No, the benefits of working from home. Zoom meeting, George, come on.
I don't know what virus you have on your machine.
Listen, I know that they talk about it being airborne, but not over 500 kilometers.
I've got the latest edition of the computer, so it's obviously.
Okay.
So how are you doing?
Yeah, all right, thanks. You've joined us right at the tail end here, unfortunately. It started at 9:30.
I must have got the wrong. Tonight's one starts at 7.
There's a couple of different sessions, George. So we've just had a big one now with Andreas Schleicher and John Hattie. It has been recorded, so I can also send you Andreas's slide deck. And then we have another big plenary tomorrow with Vickers Potter, who's the founder of the Global Teacher Award, and then one of the previous winners as well.
Yeah.
But then we've got kind of smaller sessions lined up today and tomorrow, just with some of our kind of partners like you guys at Hilton. So
Great.
So those are more localized content.
Yeah. So the one this evening, I think, is one about the privatization of schools.
Yes. Yeah. That's basically in a debate format that we're hosting with our fellows, debating the merits of it.
Okay.
And then I think there's some really good ones on inclusivity, digital pedagogy, social justice in teaching. So kind of keep a lookout for those as well.
Okay. Good. All right. Well, sorry I missed this one, but if you can, if we can get the slides, that'll be great.
I'll see if I can pop them to you now. But everyone's just been short little breakaway groups, and they're going to start coming back in about 1 second to wrap up.
Okay. Cool. All right.
Okay. Cheers.
Nice chatting. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Reminder to everyone to keep their videos off as we wrap up. As everyone rejoins the room. See, everyone is joining back in gradually. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know that in my breakout, there was probably a concern that the time was short. Alistair echoes that sentiment, definitely noted. These are very important discussions to have. Thank you nonetheless for making the time. So right now we'll wrap up opening plenary. Just want to wrap up with a reflection really on what an amazing time we've had. Lots and lots to think about, and we definitely do have our work cut out for us here at JGF, and as well as all of us here in the room, and all of us that are really concerned with this idea of what does making an impactful change in education look like overall to the system? How do we understand those wicked problems? How do we understand our ability to impact on those programs in a way that actually drives value? So I will thank you very much and remind you again that tomorrow morning, we do have our second plenary, which will focus on wicked solutions. And as facilitator for tomorrow, you will have none other than our CEO, Julian Hewitt, and we will have Vikas Potter, the founding CEO of the Vaki Foundation, and Maggie McDonald, who was only the third winner of the Global Teacher Prize when she won the prize. So it'll be an action-packed morning as well tomorrow morning. If you haven't already, please, please, please register, and we look forward to having you. Annie, Andreas, and John, thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.